Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, audience, to Leitstern episode number 8. Today, we are going to present to you in English an introduction to a very unusual character, even for people that are die-hard nationalists, die-hard rightists. This name will be still somewhat unfamiliar and somewhat marginal, but nonetheless quite important. This is why we will be paying attention to a figure from Latin America, no less today. His name, of course, Gómez Dávila. It is a pronunciation that will be corrected by our Latin America specialist Hans Vogel shortly. He will give us a short introduction. I'd just like to point out one thing, that this person does not fit into any kind of political characterization, categorization, or any kind of classical philosophical school. Nonetheless, his insights and his wit are a real asset to the dissident right. And the way he has been promoted within the dissident right has been somewhat surreptitiously. So there have been some publications in German language, recently a little bit in Dutch, and also in English there are some marginal notes to his marginal notes. I would advise people to look it up, because there are aphorisms that stick with you, that are fit to a modern mind that is preoccupied and used to sound bites, but his sound bites come from another epoch altogether. Well, having said that, I would like, as I said to our audience, Hans, to ask you for your view of the Umfeld, as you call it in German. So that is the larger setting, geographical, political, and historical, of this very important writer and publicist and philosopher to a certain extent, Dávila. Can you tell us something about how Latin American and Spanish names work, how they have to be pronounced, and how do you see this Umfeld?
Thank you. Well, of course, it's Nicolás Gómez Dávila, and Nicolás being his first name, his given name, and Gómez, the name of his father, and Dávila, the name of his mother. So in Spanish American nations, everybody carries two names. And the first name is always the name of the father, and the second name is always the name of the mother. So you go through life using these two names. And they say this has to be this is a result of the fact that there are relatively few surnames in Spanish. Gómez, Garcia, as they say in Argentina, Garcia de la Guía, Garcia from the telephone book, because everybody's half people called Garcia, and that's why you need another name to distinguish the several each Garcia, and each individual with Garcia as last name. And Gómez, Hernández, Fernández, all these names are sort of very, very common. And the only new influx of import of names has come from European immigrants, from continental Europe usually. And they have given another flavor to names especially in the southern part of Latin America. So it's called Nicolás Gómez Dávila. And Gómez is a very common, sort of a very, not an elegant name, but by the life history of the Gómez Dávila, we can tell that he is firmly part of the Colombian elite. And I should perhaps explain a bit more about what the elites in Latin America are like, because the elites in Colombia, in Peru, in Venezuela, but also in Argentina to a lesser extent. In Argentina, there was more flux, more movement in the elites than in the elites in the northern Andean nations like Venezuela and Colombia, in Ecuador, and what's it called, Peru. And the elites in those northern Latin American nations, or northern South American nations, they are very, very conservative. And they're very Catholic and very stiff upper lip, very, very snotty, very elite. They're kind of an upper class that in Europe is unknown. I think the European upper classes have been thoroughly democratized in 80 years of American occupation after the war, not to speak of what happened in Eastern Europe. But in Latin America, they have not had a war or a foreign occupation for such a long time, and they have been able to develop or to hold on to their positions for generations, for two centuries since independence. And their position was also due to people having done something important in the 18th century. So they go back to before independence, and this gives them a sort of nobility outlook, nobility attitude that's impossible to find in Europe, except in a very few cases, perhaps in Austria or in Czechoslovakia or in the Czech Republic and southern Germany, perhaps, maybe in Italy. But in Latin America, it's rather common. I mean, in Colombia, Venezuela. And what I read about Gómez Dávila exactly confirms this this knowledge of mine. So he is a typical representative of Latin American elites, and the fact that he has become sort of an important figure in Europe over the past years proves that Europeans know very little about Latin America. The knowledge about Latin American history, Latin American intellectual history, Latin American social history, Latin American sort of social relationships is non-existent in Europe. Latin America is a caricature. Everything. So it's composed of prejudices and sort of cliches. That's how people think about Latin. They're good at football. They have brown skins. They're happy. They live on sort of near the coast. They eat bananas all day, whatever. They drink rum, this sort of thing. They have sort of a very caricatural idea of what Latin Americans are really like. But if you go to Latin America and if you talk to people from the elite, you come into another world. And all these people from the elite, like Gómez Dávila also, and I've met people from, I don't know Colombia. I know Venezuela quite well. I know Argentina quite well, and also Uruguay. And the people in the elite that you see there, they have libraries in their homes that no European has. And they have a lifestyle that people in Europe can only dream of, and that they know from film, that most people in Europe have never seen. These people live on a level, and they're very civilized. They have an enormous good sort of a breadth and a scope of knowledge that you don't find in Europe. And you also find in their libraries everything from conservative Catholic thought, literature. They're fluent in English, in French, in German. They can read Portuguese, and so they're very cultured. And Gómez Dávila is a typical representative of this class. And what he said and writes about what he writes, the things he writes, sound to me rather familiar from my contacts with people in Latin American elites. So I would like to give this sort of information before we start, and I can elaborate on it if you want to, before we start discussing the matter further. That's it.
Well, today our introduction will be given in the form of, let's say, a retrospective and a perspective from the current European dissident rights. And this will be done by our colleague Sietse Bosman, joining us from Frisia. You have been relatively new to Dávila. Sietse, what was your first impression? How did it come across to you how did he come across as a thinker? And what do you think about the value of his work for the current dissident right in Europe?
Well, as you said, I wasn't really familiar with this thinker, so I got the book, The Authentic Reactionary, and it has a lot of aphorisms, or let's say Dávila writes exclusively in aphorisms. And I found, because I am very familiar with Julius Evola, of course, I found large overlap and basically ideas that are the same, very much against modernity, against democracy, against the divination of the mass man, as Dávila would say, But of course, Dávila writes from a very Catholic perspective, so he is much more focused on God, where Julius Evola doesn't necessarily mention God or believe in a God per se. And but I found this match between these writers quite striking, because they were contemporary. They lived in roughly the same time span. But as far as I know, they didn't know each other. And Dávila was, as far as I can tell, also not aware of the writings of Evola. And then it's always, nice to see that these streams of thought appear in different writers in different corners of the world, giving, in my opinion, a lot of merit to the traditionalist position. If it organically arises, over the globe with multiple thinkers, that always helps a philosophy along. But I found the book, The Authentic Reactionary, is of course what is a reactionary, and Dávila defined this as being anti-enlightenment. So it is basically going at war or agitating against everything that the Enlightenment stands for. And the term reactionary in regular discourse has come to mean simply somebody who is emotional about the past and wants to return to things as they were. And I never really understood the term or concept of reactionary that way, and I found it quite illuminating, actually, that it simply means resisting the things that the Enlightenment stand for. And I think this is one of the things that the new right or dissident right is absolutely facing. The West, the concept of the West is fundamentally and irreducibly intertwined with the concept of enlightenment. It is the emphasis on reason, it is the emphasis on science, it is the emphasis on popular vote, and all of these things that have basically become synonymous with the entire concept of the West. You cannot see the West without Enlightenment values. And the West is utterly convinced that these Enlightenment values have been beneficial to the development of the West, as in fact as opposed to, let's say, dissident right thinkers or traditionalists who would say that they have been the utter negation of whatever Europe was. So I think. There are many wisdoms in Dávila to be found. I haven't read all of his aphorisms because I believe he wrote more than 1,000. But
10,000.
But when you read, 10,000, you say?
Yes.
Oh, that's unbelievable.
Yes.
But they are all highly quotable, and therefore I think that Evola is also a bit of a favorite on the dissident right or traditionalist right. But his writings are more condensed. And Dávila writes in aphorisms, which every single one of them packs a punch against certain positions that the dissident right also wants. End to democracy, basically, restoration of tradition, or at least of hierarchy, to a certain degree, an increase in militarization, or at least a reinstitution of the warrior ethic, warrior spirit. These are all the things that basically the dissident right and traditionalist right also strive for. So I think he's a very, very interesting thinker for our movement.
Well, of course, Sietse brought up the term traditionalism. Another name for traditionalism, in its wider sense, is, of course, perennialism or eternalism. And this, of course, fits in this term perennialism fits in very well with what Sietse said. The noticeable continuity from the past that, of course, Dávila sticks to, and that is that he shares with other traditionalist writers. So eternal values being expressed in a modern setting, that is something how I would characterize his work. By the way, for people that are interested in getting an update, a literary update on the heritage of this very important Colombian writer, Gómez Dávila, I advise them to go to a new article that has appeared on geopolitica.ru. It is the think tank of Professor Dugin, of course, and there Roberto Pecchioli, he has an Italian contributor. He has published an article which has also been translated into English, which is called Gómez Dávila, The Last Reactionary. Now, of course, Dávila wouldn't have been very grateful for this adjective last, because he thought that reactionaryism, as he proposed it, was something that was eternal, and he would not have been he wouldn't have wished to have been the last one. In any case, the article 20th October geopolitica.ru is very good and will give the viewer that's not familiar with current reception of his work, Davila's work, basic information. Of course, I will here quote still the dates, 1913, 1994. So he lived from pre-First World War world, which as a young child he would have still known, till the unipolar moment after 1991. So yes, indeed, he spent most of the 20th century in experience, and he was very well informed about things that went on outside of Latin America. He was somebody that was well read in the best sense of the word. His library is rumored to have been the largest private library ever created in world history, which is saying quite something. And to just indicate how much of a nerd he was, he died in his library. So that shows something about the man. How he handled writing instead of just reading can be obvious from two aphorisms that I will coin now myself, and that is that of course, sales figures are something that are for losers, and reception and criticism and reviews are something that are for narcissists. This is how he would have also looked at his own work. He was somebody that didn't care at all about anybody's opinion about his work, who didn't want to be famous, and who just wanted to write down what he did, the aphorisms mostly, because he wanted to, on a private level, help people, friends, and so on. By the way, he was somebody that was quite familiar with other famous people in his time. He corresponded with them and he knew them personally. So Gabriel Garcia Marquez, of course, is the great novel writer from Colombia. He knew him personally, he was a friend. So this shows that this universe that appears closed on the first view was a universe that was in fact quite open to intellectual ideas from all over the world. And he was quite well informed about what went on around him. He just refused to compromise values that he saw as eternal. Now, we come, of course, to what in German we call the Sitz im Leben, which is, of course, also a sociological and anthropological term used till people forgot about the German language. Sitz im Leben means something like this: the seat in life. So the place in which somebody or something is contextually to be understood. And this, of course, is Latin America of the early 20th century. We should know that there are continuities between Latin America political thought and European political thought coming from Spain, of course, most obviously. And a name that I think is relevant here is Juan Donoso Cortés. He is a Spanish thinker, a reactionary thinker, we may say, a political philosopher of the 19th century, somebody that you could place in the line of a Metternich, somebody that proposed a holy league, a kind of alliance against any kind of modernity and any kind of liberalism and any kind of subversive ideas. And I think the way that Dávila interprets political philosophy is on a very I would say, theological level. So for him, there is no difference between political preference and theological preferences. They are one and the same package. Which brings us to another German word that's important here, and that is, of course, Weltanschauung. How do you look at the world? What is your world view? And I think here we can go back to our colleague, Hans Vogel, who can perhaps say something about the value system that the Latin America elite, especially in the time of Dávila, held on to, and how we have to understood it. On first view, I would say it has a lot to do with martial values, so honor, dignity, what you in Latin would call gravitas, so weightiness. But of course, you know Latin American history better than I do, so I would like to have your opinion about that, Hans.
Well, that's a topic about well, I have to ad lib about this, grasping or grabbing here and there from my frame of reference. But Latin American elites, it's difficult to say there's a Latin American elite altogether in the first half of the 20th century. You had different, as I said before, you had the elites in Colombia, Venezuela, which is very, very similar cultures, also with Peru, but Peru has a bigger Indian minority or majority, and so has Ecuador. And those countries are very different from Mexico and from Argentina and Chile. And Uruguay is like a dependency of Argentina. You find the same sort of attitude, the same sort of values system in Uruguay, the same discussions, the same public debate in Uruguay, and to a greater extent also in Chile as in Argentina. So Argentina is the center of the south, Buenos Aires, and then the north is Bogota is the intellectual capital of northern South America. There's no doubt. And also they say that the best Spanish, the most beautiful Spanish, is spoken in Bogota, and you immediately recognize somebody with a Bogota accent immediately, like you understand somebody from the Caribbean or from Argentina or from Chile or from Peru, Mexico. They have their distinctive accents, and the Bogota elite is very, as I said, very sort of conscious of its position. And even if you listen to popular music from Colombia, from the highlands of Colombia, not from the coastal area, not from Cartagena or the Caribbean coast or the Pacific coast, but if you listen to music, popular music from the Colombian highlands, that's a whole different ballgame. That's very cultured, long, sort of complicated verses and double entendres and play on words, very, very sophisticated. So the entire cultural environment in Colombia is of a different level, and I think I couldn't stress enough that Gómez Dávila is the representative of that culture and the elite representative of that culture. And so the elites in Latin America are sort of to be distinguished, but there are still some sort of common traits that you can discern in the first part of the 20th century. I think that part of the elites in Latin America, not in the Colombian highlands, but in the rest of Latin America, they became leftist sympathizers, but maintaining their upper class language accent. I've seen those people in Colombia, no, in Venezuela and in Argentina. You look at their libraries; they have Karl Marx and Engels and everything. They have. But they're not leftist. They read them and they profess to believe in those values, but their behavior says otherwise. They're just it's very fashionable to be leftist, to flirt with leftist ideas, and in some cases these people became sort of activists, like in Argentina or even in Brazil. But basically, it's something that they took knowledge, took sort of interest in, and they learned about, but they then forgot it, and they never became really committed leftists. You see, the committed leftists are always from the lower class and the immigrant newcomers, and that's something that's sort of also very upper class. So they can be sympathizers with the left, but their behavior and their actions are not often sort of associated with the left. They remain upper class, so they're very solid upper class. That's also goes for Gómez Dávila. And what struck me when I read about and of him, his works, well, not his works, some of his aphorisms, is that he is a modern representative, sort of a modern reincarnation of Joseph de Maistre, to a great extent. There's the same sort of intellectual wavelength and the same values as de Maistre. So he's a modern reincarnation or of an older sort of phenomenon that has been important in intellectual history of Europe as well. So I see more he is a continuation of what happened in Europe in the early 19th century, like with de Maistre, as one of the first vocal and sort of important critics of the Enlightenment. Like there's never been one a similar one like de Maistre, I think, in Europe. Maybe now, but in the 19th century certainly not. So
I think one of the events that must have inspired Gómez Dávila in his life is the fate of Mexico, which of course till 1910 was under a so-called dictatorship, Porfirio Diaz. Porfiriate, we call it, a long time of a so-called very conservative dictator ruling the country, more like a king than a dictator, in fact. And Diaz was overthrown in 1910, and after that, in that year, took place the first people don't know that, first real socialist revolution in the world. So before it happened in Europe, there was such a thing. Successful revolution, of course, in Mexico. That must have affected the elites, because Mexico for some time was seen as let's say a subversive element on the Western Hemisphere. It was invaded, of course, by America repeatedly as a result of this revolution that broke out there. It tended to upset ownership, property rights of American companies, and so on and so on. Of course, Germany was involved in those events, these revolutionary events, which rolled across the First World War as well. Everybody knows the Zimmermann telegram, which was, of course, a German attempt to link up with the revolutionary movement in Mexico and reconquer, preferably also California and Texas and Arizona and so on. It's a quite fantastical scheme. In any case, it shows that there was a considerable alternative power source at that time during the lifetime of the early lifetime of Gómez Dávila in Latin America, which, by the way, was also found in some other countries. I like to remind people of, for example, the years of Sandino, so the Sandinistas, of course, in Nicaragua, is a movement formed on the basis of Sandino, which was also something of a socialist, nationalist, freedom fighter, also in that time. So there was a lot of, let's say, subversive activity. And I think that what Hans said here is very relevant, because it shows a kind of a schizophrenic position of the elites, the Latin American elites. On the one hand, very progressive. On the other hand, having tended previously to a very, let's say, almost feudal system. And then appropriating these leftist ideas to the point that Mexico eventually even accepted Trotsky as a refugee in the 40s, in the 30s and 40s. So this is a very interesting time frame, I guess, in Latin American history. And I think another common theme that you can find between some of these forces at work is the theme of heroism. So that is also something you can see in Gómez Dávila. So he always prefers to be fighting in the last ditch, fighting for a lost cause, standing on the last barricade against the flood of evil modernity. That is something that you can see, the stand against all odds, something that is, of course, strangely reflected in those so-called subversive leftist elements, such as Sandino, who said sovereignty is not something that we discuss with anybody, including America. Sovereignty is something that the people defend with a gun in their hands. And that's, of course, a sentiment that we find throughout Latin American history, from Bolivar onwards, which is still alive till today. So I like to remind our audience that the country we are talking about here, Colombia, is today strangely one of the bastions of, let's say, multipolar rhetoric. So its president, for example, has delegitimized Israel in the United Nations and has called for the formation of an international army of liberation. Well, that sounds something like the people in the time of Bolivar would have appreciated. Of course, this is rhetoric. And Colombia, it used to be one of they call it the poodles of the United States in Latin America. That apparently has changed. Of course, Colombia had a long time also this FARC movement, this ultra communist movement, which had an indigenous root, which was not based upon European models. The same is true in Peru. It also had such a movement. It had the Shining Path, which was kind of an indigenous form of Maoism, very interesting. So there is this, let's say, this strange balance between this rhetoric, this martial honor, and this very peculiar forms of nationalism that you find in Latin America, which are reflected in the work, I would say, of Gómez Dávila in a very beautiful, worded, traditionalist, valuable way. In any case, so Sietse, we were talking about this tradition that is visible in Latin America of honor, martial honor. So what Nietzsche would call the Waffen- und Wehrinstinct, so the instinct of defending yourself by force of arms. How do you see this reflected in Gómez Dávila? Because I see that. I see his predisposition to, let's say, martial rhetoric, the willingness to defend values at all costs. I think this is an ethos and a line of thought that's quite important for the dissident right, especially in the current predicament of the European peoples. How do you look at that?
Well, when you read the aphorisms of Gómez Dávila, he is, of course, a staunch defender of aristocratic and the aristocratic soul. And aristocracy, for a large degree, or you could say the largest degree, is honor-based. It is the acknowledgement and the acceptance and the bearing of the responsibility of honor that sets the aristocrat apart from the mass man. The mass man is unprincipled, basically, and yeah, well, that is a general statement. But if you look at Ortega y Gasset, that's basically the conclusion. The main principle of the mass man is consumption, and that is exactly what Gómez Dávila agitates against. He hates everything that has to do with consumerist society, and an aristocrat is always concerned with his honor. That's what aristocratic behavior is about. A carefully dressed up table for your dinner guests is not just something to show off with. It has to do with your honor. It is your ability to to create order in chaos. And when you read Dávila, another writer comes to mind, and that is Eliade and his book The Sacred and the Profane. And I think that these two mesh very well in the fact that one must have an axis mundi, one must have a sacred center, and for to exist at all, to make sense of the world and to have direction in the world. And Dávila, of course, is a staunch Catholic, and for him, his faith is exactly this: one can only truly exist as a human and understand the world if there is a sacred center, an axis mundi in your world. And so I think these two things are absolutely connected, and that's one of the main focuses of Dávila.
Well, of course, the notion of aristocracy and even clergy, so two of the three pillars of Indo-European civilization, these two groups have been virtually eliminated from day-to-day life throughout Western cultures at this moment. But they tend to be very emphasized in, I would say, the Hispanic and Latin American tradition. So, of course, we're all familiar with the figure of Don Quixote. Yes, Don Quixote is fighting against windmills. If you listen to the aphorisms of Gómez Dávila, you recognize the sentiment and the idealism and the pleasure of charging these windmills. I think that's something that I read into them, of course. What do you think, Hans? Do you think that sentiment is still more present in Latin American cultures than it is in Europe, from which, of course, Latin American culture partially derives? What is your view on that?
Well, once again, it's difficult. Having done made my career in Latin American history, it's the more you know about it, the more you understand that Latin America is a collective name for a group of countries and cultures that are very sort of highly defined and different from among each other. So it's and in this respect, your question is also difficult to answer, because it's difficult to say generalize at the Latin American level. And I would say that the sense of honor that one finds so present in the elite, and especially in the writings of Gómez Dávila, for me, also may have to do with the fact that Colombia went through a very painful period in its history from 1948 to 1958. Because maybe you guys know it, but there was this there were two parties in Colombia, the liberals and the conservatives, and they had been battling each other since the 19th century. And you can, I know this because of one of my professors when I studied was David Bushnell. He was the main American expert on Colombian history. Intimately known in Colombia, very much appreciated in Colombia, also given special orders, etc., distinctions in Colombia. And he explained to me that Colombia had been in a constant civil war since its independence, since the 1830s, until very recently. Colombia has always been in civil war with two parties, the liberals and the conservatives. And when one party won the elections, the other party went underground and started to fight the winner. So the loser of the elections always went underground and fought the winner of the elections, leading to lots of violence. And there was an upflare in this long series between 1948 and 1959. In 1948, there was the liberal candidate who was destined to win, and the Americans killed him together with some Colombian cronies. Jorge Eliezer Gaitan. You can look him up. He was also elite, very popular, very much sort of he looked set to become a sort of a a savior of Colombia after the war. And he was killed right before the elections. I think right before. This became a civil war. La violencia, the violence, leading to a bloodbath of undreamed of proportions. And it only stopped in 1958, so 10 years civil war in Colombia. And I think this strengthened the tendency in Gómez Dávila to rise up from this, to go beyond this division, because divisions of this kind are destructive for any kind of society. And the elite has the responsibility to run the country peacefully and to be there as a factor of stability in the country. That's the role of the elite in the political sort of arrangement. And I think he wanted to stress that, and thereby have the support of the Roman Catholic Church. That's the background and that's how you can understand him better, I think, against this background. So that's maybe I think it's a good answer to your question. Maybe you think different otherwise, but ask me more if you want to.
Well, Latin America, of course, from a European point of view, is something on which values can also be easily projected. So the 1968 generation projected its revolutionary feelings on people in Latin America, like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. Of course, that's true to a certain extent now as well. So we are looking up at the heroic Venezuela standing up against the American aggressor. Well, in Europe ourselves, we are asleep and doing nothing. Mm-hmm. But that's, of course, a projection of your own predicament on a totally different situation. So that's something that's very dangerous. But the sentiment of heroism as a basic traditionalist attitude, of course, inherently aristocratic attitude, that is something that is definitely, that sticks out, that characterizes the writings of Gómez Dávila. It's something that is virtually lacking, I would say, in continental European thinking, which is probably infected with intellectualism, kind of a tendency to abstract theories instead of practical applications, in Western Europe at least. But I think there might be a change coming, because things are getting quite kinetic in Europe as well. I mean, there is inflation, there is actual war taking place, there are actual large streams of refugees making their way across the continent. Things are changing somewhat. And there is, of course, the rhetoric of the fake European elite as well, which is going in the direction of war. War was something that, in many situations, Gómez Dávila would have welcomed. So he said, there will be no negotiations till we are out of bullets. And he is talking, of course, about his cause, which was the reactionary cause. That sentiment is something that in Europe is not yet visible in any kind of intellectual elite. There used to be intellectual elites in Europe that were tied up with liberation movements, tied up with national resistance movements. But that seems to be not the case here. So in this sense, Gómez Dávila, he is probably somebody that needs to be understood better in terms of ethics. So the ethical component I find very important here. And the heroic quest, it can also have an intellectual aspect. That's very clearly what Gómez Dávila does. He actually weaponizes ideas. He weaponizes heritage in a certain way. And he stands up for them in a perhaps somewhat quixotic way, but in a nonetheless very appealing way for people that are overcharged and burdened with, let's say, fake theater, feel-good theater, as we are in Europe and as we are in the West in general. So I find very valuable about him. Now,
Yes.
of course, then there is the question of the person himself. So we are talking here about first about a struggle, a public struggle, which he also appeals to. But in the last resort, Gómez Dávila is a private person who retreats to the library, and he is going in what the Germans would call innerliche Emigration, so the interior emigration. So you exit the present world into an interior world. Um, of course, that's something that you find in many philosophies, but he does it in a very peculiar way in his own life. And this is something I would like to ask you about, Sietse. So you are quite well read in traditionalism. You are as close as it gets to be a traditionalist in Frisia, in your home country. How do you look at the inner immigration, the interior immigration, as a valid strategy for a traditionalist or a perennialist or even a dissident rightist at this moment in Europe, in our current predicament? How do you look at it?
Well, my view of that is that um, when society at large has abandoned the axis mundi, then to a certain extent you must go inward and find your axis mundi within yourself. There needs to be an anchor point, a fixed center from which you establish your reality. I read about a scientist that said something that doesn't have boundaries cannot be traversed. So there is no direction, there is no navigating possible in something that doesn't have boundaries or a center. And I think that Julius Evola would basically agree that I don't think he was very much about meditation, but it's much more about cultivating that aspect of yourself that can function temporarily as the axis mundi, while society at large is adrift, basically. So yeah, how shall I frame this? I just think that it is. Well, what Nietzsche would basically say, it is about the Übermensch at this point, or as Evola would say, the man who is riding the tiger. It is the one who can cultivate superior values to the rotting society around him, and is able to basically serve the wave of decay to its completion, and be ready to build whatever comes next. And this is, of course, a recurring theme for the dissident right. We, at least I think, we should positively stimulate the collapse of whatever we have now, because it's beyond salvation. It must be demolished and done away with, and we have to go back to something that is more traditional. And I think Gómez Dávila would absolutely agree. I think that there's one statement he made. He said, "I distrust every idea that my contemporaries do not find retarded or or grotesque." So that is basically being the inverse of everything that is considered normal, and therefore, yeah, the person who lives in such recognitions among a society as we have has but little options as to go inward, this innerlijke migration, as to find a place of salvation, because many of people who are on our wavelength, to speak with Hans's terms, experience this, and there are very few people who you can actually connect with and identify with in these times of chaos and disorder. And that's why I think ultimately the right has such difficulty uniting.
Well, of course, the sentiment of, let's say, the right to bear arms against the masses, right? The rejection of mass rule. This is something that is clear from the writings of Gómez Dávila. He says diplomas cannot cure an analphabetic soul. So
Yes,
the education of the masses, the cosmopolitanism of the masses, the tourism of the masses, the wealth of the masses, they are opposite values. He said the only way that common man can be virtuous is by poverty. Poverty is a gift. He considered all progress on the material front and on the so-called education front as counterproductive. And if we look at the 20th century and the outcome of the 20th century, which we are now living with, of course, that point has been proven. In this sense, I remember another aristocrat who was active in another part of the world with a sword and not with a pen. His name is called Roman Sternberg. He was one of the last white generals who went to Mongolia and from there took up the sword with his mini army to fight against the Soviet Union. And his plan was literally like a Genghis Khan, kill all the low people. This means all people that had no ability to lift themselves out of an animalistic level, of a materialistic level. That was his antidote to the Bolshevik Revolution. Of course, his crusade ended quite quickly. After a few months, he was executed. But Gómez Dávila's crusade is still with us. And we should not forget that Gómez Dávila, his fallback position was very simple. His fallback position is the Axis Mundi, as Sietse Bosman has just told us, but the Axis Mundi in a very specific way, namely the cross, the Axis Mundi of the cross. That means the Christian value system that preceded the Enlightenment. In his case, there was the Catholic Church. And God was for him the ultimate reference point. And unashamedly, he was a religious man who believed that everything that was not related to the eternal and not related to God was unimportant and without value. So all value derived from a divine task or a divine mission that man is on or should be on. And if he hasn't, he shouldn't admit to it, he would have said. So it is a question of being religious, even if you are not. Well, having said that, I would give the last word to our Latin American specialist. Can you say something about your view of Gómez Dávila as a guide or as a light for the dissident right in our current predicament on Vogel?
Thank you, Alexander. I would like to do so, but not before having sort of made a small side remark on what you said just now about the values inherent in Gómez Dávila, but also in sort of Sternberg that you mentioned in Mongolia. You find an echo of this kind of thought in like Yuval Harari, the advisor to the WEF, and of some WEF people who also want to dispossess the majority of the population and live the life of a sort of a fake nobility, so that's what I thought. So it's not really unique in especially in the current framework that we're living in. But I think the value is in the fact that he wrote aphorisms. Who can you think of any statesman, philosopher, writer who produces thousands upon thousands of aphorisms, that each of these quotable? That's a unique situation, and this makes him stand out from all the others who write and who sort of put their thoughts on paper. Because if you can be quoted in aphorisms, you have an advantage over all the others that write lengthy volumes and thick volumes, and that people shy away from and are reluctant to read, certainly in this day and age when people are no longer able to read anything longer than 2,000 words or whatever. So that's the advantage, and the clarity of his thought, and the conflictuous aspects of the situation that he lived in and the country that he lived in, which is also very similar to our situation today. we also live in a very conflictive situation, very antithetical between groups, very conflictuous, very uncertain outcome, and the same as his country, Colombia, in the 20th century. So that's I think the value. So because he prefigures, or he may be a guide to people looking for some sort of something concrete to hold on, like Archimedes also wants to have a fixed point in the universe to hold on to. That may be the value that he has, I think.
Well, of course, it is true what you said about the aristocratic fault occurring to people that are not worthy of the aristocratic fault in the traditional sense. So you mentioned Yuval Harari. I had a conversation when I was in Hungary with somebody that I will not quote by name, but who was quite high up positioned in Hungarian society. And his opinion about the vaccination campaign in Hungary in 2021 was the following. He said, "We hope as a government that all our liberal city folk will take the Western vaccines, and that all our country folk will take the Chinese and Russian vaccines, because in that way we will have a natural selection." So he wanted to create a new aristocracy in that way. Of course, that thought has also occurred within our own movement. The dissident right, the last couple of years, has experienced grave crisis of selection, in which many people that once were considered worthwhile are not considered so anymore. And opposite, other people have joined who are now considered worthwhile, the ranks of the dissident right. But you are quite correct about the ultimate value of Gómez Dávila. That is the aphorism form. And I like to remind our audience that Gómez Dávila himself said so. He said, in the future, the only people that will still read are reactionaries. And what will be left to those who are not? Well, perhaps their aphorisms will survive. Well, all that having been said, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists here, Sietse Bosman and Hans Vogel, and also our audience for watching this 8th episode of Leitstern. And I advise them, go and read. If you are reactionaries, you are worth it. And if you cannot, at least recall the aphorisms of Gómez Dávila. Thank you very much.